Before we start, this episode contains language and scary stories that might not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion advised.
You're listening to Sorry.
Today will be mostly sunny and pleasant, high of 80. Degree that.
You're listening.
당신은 지금 듣고 있습니다.
Вы слушаете.
Estás escuchando.
Unasikiliza
to GPSG Radio.
From the Indiana University.
El equipo de gobierno de los estudiantes graduados.
Graduate and Professional Student Government.
Broadcasting from Bloomington, Indiana, it's GPSG Radio, the podcast for Indiana University's graduate and professional student government. I'm Rick Brewer. Each week, GPSG Radio brings you the latest GPSG news, as well as stories and interviews from around campus, in order to help all graduate and professional students better navigate life in Bloomington. Coming up in the show today, a special Halloween edition featuring a story about the Indiana Memorial Union and the Student Activities Tower.
I haven't really experienced much on the fourth floor. It's been pretty bland. The third floor, however, I have some weird happenings.
And you'll also hear an interview with Shannon Larson, a PhD candidate from the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, who's writing her dissertation on the supernatural and abandoned psychiatric institutions.
And when they found her, there was this blood stain right around her. And they removed the body, but now to this day they say that the blood stain does not go away. As much as they wipe it down or they, try to get rid of it, the blood stain is still there.
But first, the latest news from GPSG.
Happy Halloween, graduate students. This is Shay, back with the news. This week we have GPSG Night at the IU Theater to watch Peter and the Starcatcher. Student tickets are only $10, and you can come by a little bit early at 6:30 for a reception just before the 7:30 p.m. curtain. We're also starting a new type of event called GPSG Talks. Our first one is next week, Wednesday, November 8th from 9 to 10 p.m. at Bears Place. Be sure to come by and support your fellow graduate students while they give informal talks about their academic interest and endeavors. We'll see you there. That's it for the news.
What you're about to hear is a short audio story I produced for American Student Radio about the Indiana Memorial Union's Student Activities Tower, which is one of the most haunted places on the IU campus. Legend has it, when the tower used to be part of the hotel, on two separate occasions, both a woman and dog committed suicide by jumping out of the fourth floor windows and landed in the same spot. It is also said that the elevator in the tower will mysteriously stop on the fourth floor and open its doors to only find no one there.
I'd say most college campuses have a fair share of ghost stories, but what I've noticed about IU is that it seems to have maybe more than some other campuses. And what I will say about IU is it has some particularly grisly, kind of disturbing legends about it.
This is Shannon Larson.
And I'm a PhD student in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology.
Shannon is writing her dissertation on supernatural experiences and abandoned psychiatric institutions. But when she first arrived in Bloomington, she was a tour guide for IU's annual Ghost Walk, a tour of the most haunted places on campus, run by the Folklore and Ethnomusicology Association. I first heard of these spooky legends while working in the university archives as a student assistant. People would request to see the archive collection of the papers from the Ghost Walk. I ended up taking a look at it myself, to only find hundreds of documents and newspaper clippings detailing ghost stories and hauntings at IU, some dating as far back as 1911. It was shocking. But there was this one story in particular that caught my eye, a story about suicide in the 7-story tower in the Indiana Memorial Union, and what is now referred to as the Student Activities Tower.
And so when it was part of the hotel, it said that a young woman committed suicide. She found a way out of one of the upper windows of that tower and jumped. Years later, I know it sounds silly, but a dog also jumped out of that tower and supposedly died in the same spot.
After looking through hundreds of documents in the university archives, I was unable to find a name, date, or any documentation confirming that a woman and a dog jumped out of the IMU tower. Nevertheless, this legend continues.
People believe that this tower is now haunted by the spirits of that woman and the dog, and the most common thing that's said about the tower is that the elevator will mysteriously stop on floor 4, which people say that's where the suicide victims would have jumped from. But so the 4th floor often the elevator will mysteriously stop, open for no one, and then continue on its way. And people have also, there was a strange experience that a janitor had there, that someone, he actually took the time to like write to the folklore department and tell us about his experience.
Which is true. A man named Robert Dubinsky, not sure if he was a janitor, emailed the folklore department. Dated October 17, 2003. His email details the haunting experience he had one summer night while doing a routine lockup of the tower. He called his story the bare bones truth. Mr. Dubinsky, quote, heard the most mysterious mumbled Arabic chant. It startled me very much, and my mind began to race with all the tales surrounding the 5th floor, end quote. As Mr. Dubinsky became increasingly frightened, he went to make sure the rest of the doors in the tower were locked, and then began to hear the chant coming through his radio attached to his hip. He ran down the stairs to escape, and saw his reflection in the window along with a, quote, dark shadow of a man, end quote, chasing behind him. Once I heard Mr. Dubinsky's story, I knew I needed to learn more about this tower. Have people claimed to experience hauntings like this recently? And the elevator, does it mysteriously stop on the 4th floor?
So my name is Matt Hamilton. I am a building manager here at the Indiana Memorial Union. My responsibilities basically are to make sure the doors that need to be locked up are locked up.
I got in touch with Matt to give me a behind-the-scenes tour of the IMU, and to hear if he's had any supernatural experiences in the tower since he started working there a little over a year ago.
I haven't really experienced much on the 4th floor. It's been pretty bland. The 3rd floor, however, I have some weird happenings. So often there's this door that I'm required to shut. It's a machine room that's just found open, and there really is nobody that I can think of, I guess, within the building who would have access to that. And there's no reason for anybody to have been in there. And I know, once it's locked, or once I lock it up, it's good. It's locked for good.
Matt also told me a story about a time when he had to catch a bat when it flew into the Union. Once he released the bat, a few seconds later, a hawk snatched it. But that was on the 3rd floor of the Biddle Hotel, not in the tower. Eventually, Matt took me to the haunted 4th floor, where I could take a closer look at the rooms and windows and see if such a suicide would have been possible. As we're looking in the 4th floor here where this alleged suicide happened, when you're walking in here, you can just kind of tell that it used to be a dorm/hotel at one point. It's kind of eerie because it's sort of been repurposed and renovated.
We can check out what these sort of rooms look like too.
Okay.
Habitat is one of the better rooms.
It was obvious these rooms used to be part of a hotel, as they still contained bathtubs and sinks.
So very easily someone could have opened this up, climbed out, and jumped. I mean, it wouldn't have been difficult at all. And at this point, these windows are secured, but I'm sure there were times when they were not, and people could just access it whenever they wanted. I just get this feeling that I know people have slept here, and that's not just from knowing that people actually have slept here. I feel like when I first came here, I just got that feeling. It's like just smelling it a little bit, just kind of it throws me off. I really don't like this tower much at all.
So, it's possible that a woman and a dog could have jumped out of the windows on the 4th floor. It was once part of the hotel, and the windows and rooms checked out. But what about the elevator? Does it randomly stop on the 4th floor? There was only one way to find out. When I rode the tower elevator, I went around midnight because that's when you're supposed to go, right? And I just kept going up and down, and up and down. I was expecting to hear the sounds of a woman crying and the bark of a dog, or perhaps the Arabic chants, but nothing happened. The temperature never dropped below freezing, I didn't hear any sounds out of the ordinary, and the elevator always went to the floors I selected. It always seems like when we try and force an experience like this, it never works out. But maybe the point isn't whether these folktales really did happen, or if the elevator myth is just that, a myth. Again, Shannon Larson.
To a folklorist, it does not matter whether or not ghosts are real. We don't care. We find cultural value, we find historical value in these narratives. Often legends, supernatural narratives like this, they will reflect everyday fears and anxieties. They will reflect a desire to kind of test the boundaries of the known world. So legends and folklore in general, they offer people a way to kind of communicate about things that are deeply embedded fears, anxieties, contemporary issues that need to be discussed or examined. And so that's really where we see the value in folklore and in supernatural folklore in particular.
Music in this piece comes from Blue Dot Sessions. For American Student Radio, I'm Rick Brewer. Special thanks to all the producers at American Student Radio for their help on that last piece. I had a great time making it. Coming up next is an interview with Shannon Larson, who you just heard from in the last piece. But in this interview, Shannon and I talk about her dissertation and some of the spookiest legends she's ever encountered. Now, did you always want to be a folklorist growing up?
No.
When did this passion start for you?
I think probably, you asked that question, and there were probably things that I wanted to be when I was growing up that were maybe similar to being a folklorist. So I think I was always interested in the type of material that I get to study now. But I would say I first discovered that I could study folklore academically when I was an undergrad at University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And I took a folklore and literature class there. And so that was maybe the first thing that brought it to my awareness. And then I also started noticing that I kept buying lots of books on folklore, folk tales, ghost stories, all this stuff that would be considered folklore. And I just really enjoyed reading for fun, those types of materials. And so that's kind of how I got started, I would say.
Now, for our listeners at home who might not know exactly what folklore or ethnomusicology is, how would you best describe it?
Well, our favorite definition would be that it's, quote, artistic communication in small groups. And that's a quote that comes from a folklorist called Dan Ben Amos. And so basically, to break that down a little bit, it means that folklore is the informal culture that is everywhere. And we all have it, and it's something that happens every day. It's something that it can be narratives, right? It can be verbal, artistic communication, but it can also be like customs that we perform that are very informal and that are learned from when we're children, and get passed down through families, right, or through cultures. It can also be material culture. So some of my colleagues study things like pots or quilts, for example. But what those things all have in common is that this is informal learned culture, and it all is traditional. But what that basically means too is that tradition is something dynamic. So it's something that we learn, but we pass it down. But each time we do that, it changes a little bit to fit new cultural situations, new concerns, new contemporary situations.
Now, your dissertation topic is extremely fascinating. And as soon as I heard it, I said, I got to have you on the podcast because, so how would you best describe it, number one, and then how did it start?
Sure. So I'm interested in narratives, right? As a folklorist. Like I said, that's not just what folklore is, but there's a lot of other things that folklore includes. But, narrative is what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in supernatural folklore in particular. So I study things like ghost stories and legends. And legends would be, a lot of people have heard of urban legends, right? And those are basically stories that people tell that are a little bit unusual, and they're considered plausible, but we can't necessarily prove that they happened, for example, right? And so a lot of ghost stories kind of fall into this category, right? Ghost stories are considered legends. And I was always interested as well in mental illness and how people perceive mental illness and the stigma related to mental illness. And so these are kind of two, they may seem like very different topics, but my dissertation topic actually combines those two passions that I have. And I'm writing my dissertation on contemporary folklore about abandoned psychiatric institutions. And so what that means is that starting in the 1960s, there was this move to close a lot of the big mental asylums that were once really prevalent in the United States and other parts of the world. And they started to close because of policy changes and financial cutbacks. But basically the idea was that they were no longer an effective way of dealing with the mentally ill. And so these institutions closed, and they're gigantic, massive campuses, right? And a lot of communities have them. And now they're just sitting abandoned in these communities. And so what happens is people start, investigating them and breaking into these old abandoned buildings late at night. And we call that legend tripping, right? People go visit these sites and they tell ghost stories about them. And those ghost stories get shared in the community where these institutions are. And they also, there's an element of tourism. So now that a lot of these places are abandoned and there are all of these creepy stories about them, people will actually pay money to go on tours, like supernatural ghost tours or haunted houses that are held there, or just to kind of look around and explore. And so what I'm doing for my dissertation is I'm collecting these types of narratives and the experiences people have there, and also, what it's like to go. I've gone on a lot of the tours myself, and so I have like this participant observation perspective, and I'm basically collecting all of that to try to analyze why people are so interested in these institutions and why people tell and experience these types of things there, and what that all means for how we as a culture view mental illness and psychiatric healthcare.
That is so fascinating. And I remember we had briefly talked about how in Athens, Ohio, there was an insane asylum that you had been studying as well that I had actually been to.
Yeah,
correct?
Yeah. It's called the Ridges. And from what I understand, and I haven't studied this one heavily, but its story, the main story about it is quite memorable. And that's that, it was once a psychiatric institution, and then the university there bought it up. And what's the university there?
Ohio University.
Yeah, Ohio University. So they bought up the abandoned institution. And the most famous narrative that is told about that place is one about a spirit known as Margaret, I believe, Margaret Schiller. I think that's her name.
That name just sounds creepy.
Anyway, she was a mental patient, and she got lost, right? And people couldn't find her, and she just disappeared, right? She was a patient there, and she just disappeared. Nobody found her. Until much later, they discovered that she had basically gotten locked into this room that was no longer being used, right? And so that in itself kind of shows that the institution was starting to close down, and there were like these rooms kind of left unused in the building, and she ended up dying. And when they found her, there was this blood stain right around her. And they removed the body, but now to this day, they say that the blood stain does not go away. As
Oh,
much
wow.
as they wipe it down or they, try to get rid of it, the blood stain is still there. So that's an example of one of the types of stories or narratives that I would study.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Thank you.
It's tough to segue into this next question, but I'll do my best. But what attracted you to come to IU and Bloomington?
Well, it was the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. It's considered the best place to study folklore and ethnomusicology. And I should have mentioned that ethnomusicology is very similar to folklore in our methodology and sort of our approach. But of course, it's studying music instead of studying narrative and the customary and the material stuff that I mentioned. So we're closely related. We're different fields, but we are so closely related that we go quite well here together at IU. And it was a very important department because it was one of the first places that I think it was the first place you could get a PhD in folklore, at least in North America. And so it's quite a historic department. And it's very important. While I've been here, they have won an award for being the best place to study folklore and ethnomusicology. So it's a really great department, and that's what drew me here.
Now, you have been in Bloomington for a while now.
Yeah, so that's
it's
going on 7 years. Well, it has been 7 years, I think, in August.
So you've had a chance to try a lot of the different restaurants around town. What would you say are some of your favorites?
Oh, man. I am kind of addicted to pizza. So I like King Dough a lot. That's a fairly newer place. Mother Bear's has always been a good standby, though I will never get a Mother Bear's pizza without vodka sauce. You have to get the vodka sauce, otherwise it's just not worth it.
I'll have to try that now.
I'm just kidding. I mean, but no, that's the best. And then I do love a lot of the international restaurants along 4th Street. Like the Thai places and the Indian places. I love that part of Bloomington's cuisine, right? All of the different international food options we have.
Mm-hmm. And then what would you say is your favorite thing to do in Bloomington that's not food related?
Actually, I use the Beeline Trail a lot. And I feel like maybe not a lot of students know about that, but I love to run and I love to be outside. And so I often run on the Beeline Trail, and it turns into different trails actually, and you can, if you like to run long distance like I do, you can go about 13 miles on it there and back, and it's it gets into like wooded areas, and it can be pretty beautiful at the right time of year. So I really enjoy that.
From what my understanding is that the Beeline used to be a train track, I believe, right?
Yeah, part of it. Yeah, that's right. And so after it's the Beeline, I think it becomes rail to trail or something, like it changes names. Like, as I said, there are different parts of the trail. But yeah, you can see, I think they have part of it marked where you can kind of learn. They have some plaques you can read and stuff about when it used to be a train track. So,
Well, Shannon, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and we hope to see you at some GPSG events this year.
Thank you very much.
That's about all the time we have left on this special Halloween edition of GPSG Radio. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app to receive weekly automatic downloads of GPSG Radio. New episodes published every Tuesday. GPSG Radio is produced and hosted by me, Rick Brewer, with contributions from Shay Smock, Enos Nassar, and music help from Craig Davis and Lauren Gaynor. This is GPSG Radio. I'm Rick Brewer. GPSG Radio.